That's kind of what it is. It's just the way that it is unfortunately presented to make America's use of the atom bomb seemingly more positive. There's a lot of other nuclear, like pro-nuke propaganda, which I haven't even gotten to. It's pretty gross when you think about it, but there's the other side of this in the post-nuclear war, in the Cold War, the nuclear arms race being considered a positive thing because that's, you know, you never get two nations with nuclear arms warring one another. So it actually created a moment of peace on the planet. Like this is another very common perspective that mutually assured destruction is actually a good thing because it stops nation states from warring with one another. Except the reality is that we haven't stopped warring at all. And, you know, we just have proxy wars instead, Ukraine being a great example. And it's like literally countries that have less and that don't have nukes are the ones who are getting fucked over now. Reading all those books for that nuclear bomb video gave me a gigantic dislike for Oppenheimer and his belated weepiness. People were telling him. It's not like they didn't know what was going to happen. To ignore them and then only later cry about it is tremendously irritating. To be clear, he was very much not just a neutral scientist inventing a thing that was later used for war. This part is true. He was explicitly making a weapon. He had input on where and how it should be used, and he ignored petitions advocating for less lethal usage / demonstration of the bomb. He was 100% like, fuck yes, let's use this sucker ASAP, until afterwards when he got all performatively poetic and sad. Piss off with that. That's what he says. That's at least Sean's perspective on it. Azan, if a world war broke out, literally every nation would suffer. Yes, but this treats war as an inevitability. You understand? And already world wars are not happening in the same ways that you think it's happening. It's already happening for people in Ukraine. It's already happening for Syria. It's happening in Palestine. It's happening in Yemen. It's happening every fucking day. It's just that it's not happening in your immediate vicinity. The only thing that a world war shelters, the only thing that nuclear proliferation of this regard shelters is people living in countries that have developed nuclear weapons. In countries that, and even then, not exactly, right? Because they do see the impact of such a thing. They do still see like the economic consequences of such decisions and whatnot, but like they don't, it just protects the imperial core. That's it. The U.S. would have 100p declared war on USSR if it weren't for nukes. I know, but we're talking about a world where we haven't engaged in nuclear proliferation. Do you understand what I'm saying? I do not believe that. I agree with a few topics, but Hassan, cringe overall. Thanks, Fruit Snacks. I'm glad that you agree at least. Maybe you're opening your mind up a little bit. I think that I do not believe that having a world-ending weapon is ever a good thing. I do not believe that having more access to weapons have made us more civilized when we see the exact opposite. All right, let's continue.
Actually defeat the Allies militarily. They had known that for quite a while. Their only hope for their military was to use whatever was left of it to drag out the war with the hopes of securing better peace terms for themselves. Secondly, Japan had to be in a hopeless diplomatic situation and be aware of that. Now, ever since the Russians signed the secret pact...
Does that also work with your take that more nations should get nukes? We're not talking... Okay, there's two different worlds, guys. There's two different worlds, okay? A lot of people point to the Hasanabi doctrine, which I always say, get nukes. There's two different universes, which I think the movie basically fucking showed perfectly. That's why the last beat of the movie is... I did actually create a chain reaction that destroyed the world. That's the whole point, because the world is forever different. With the advent of the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons, the world is permanently different, okay? It's done. There is no going back on that. That is why when I say this, I'm talking about realpolitik. I'm talking about the world as it exists in a post-nuclear proliferated world. Okay? Do you understand? My perspective on the matter is very different in a pre-nuclear world. Anyone ever think that it happened? Rehashing and putting shit into kids' minds isn't going to fix anything. This is the world we live in now. Wait, what? Non-proliferation is just not realistic. It's like, what if no one invented the light bulb? That's ridiculous. No, it's not like what if no one invented the light bulb. There is a very real moment where leaders of the world, despite warring with one another, could have very easily, especially even after like Germany's defeat, could have very easily gotten to a point where they were like, all right, we should definitely stop this immediately. We should get together and we should just make a pact. We're not doing this. We're not fighting one another. You always have this same assumption that many people do, which is that like people are just going to be evil. Nations are going to be evil. We are always going to, we've literally agreed not to use chemical weapons. The U.S. and Nazi Germany didn't use mustard gas. Why is that, chat? Like, there are certain things we could have done. There are certain things we could have done at a given moment. And by the way, the reason why, for example, Central Committee is correct, but also, ironically, we now use chemical weapons all the fucking time. We use plenty of different techniques that we consider to be illegal and will literally tell other countries not to use. You want to know why? Because we dropped the bomb. We did it. To this day, we are the only country that dropped it on fucking civilian territory, okay? So that's the point. That's why now we get to literally do whatever the fuck we want. And there are so many like interesting ways in which we change the planet. We talk about the theoretical ways. We talk about the spiritual ways in some respects. But there are very literal physical ways in which we change the planet, like the fact that, for example, we have to rely on, if we want to get like X-ray proof material, we have to go and fucking engage in deep sea diving to find shipwrecks from a pre-atom bomb era, because every single piece of steel, every single piece of steel on the planet that was, you know, exposed to the elements when the atom bomb blew up is now technically corrupted. That's such an interesting thing to think about. You know, like every single aspect of this planet is like relatively irradiated. That's the old method. Modern smelters don't produce contaminated steel. Low background steel, also known as pre-war steel, is any steel produced prior to the detonation of the first nuclear bomb in 1940 and 1950s, typically sourced from ships, either as a part of regular scrapping or in shipwrecks and other steel artifacts in this era. It's often used for modern particle detectors because more modern steel is contaminated with traces of nuclear fallout. So did you like the movie or not? No, I loved the movie. The movie was great. It stands on its own as a movie. It's like great from a movie perspective. Anyway, I got to pee real quick.
Act to declare war on Japan at the Yalta Conference, the Japanese government was in a hopeless diplomatic situation. But for a long time, they didn't understand that they were. They held out hope for Russian mediation all the way until the Soviet Union declared war on them. Now, some of the actions of the Allies undoubtedly contributed to Japan not understanding the position they were in, principal among those probably being the Soviet Union's signature being struck off the Potsdam Declaration. But we also can't ignore the capacity for willful ignorance and self-deception among the members of the Japanese leadership. They should have known their situation was hopeless. After the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, however, the Japanese leadership finally understood this second point. And I'd like to add something here. The strategic bombing survey that I mentioned at the start of the video stated Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. Now, I don't actually agree with that, on the Russia point anyway. I personally feel that if the Japanese leadership, with regards to getting help from the Soviet Union, thought there was any hope remaining whatsoever, they probably never would have surrendered even if it meant their entire country was burned to the ground. The Soviet Union declaring war on Japan was crucial in that it forced them to confront their hopeless diplomatic situation. To return to our list of things Japan needed in order to end the war, third is an assurance that the imperial institution would not be abolished. This was the main problem the Japanese leadership had with the Allied demand for unconditional surrender, of course. And I'd argue that the question of the emperor was the most important point on this list. And that's both on a national level, the emperor being a very important figure in Japanese society, but also on a personal level, because it's the emperor himself intervening to end the war. So an assurance that the emperor himself would not be executed as a result of doing that would probably help to speed things along there. People who defend the atomic bombings as being necessary often point to the bluster of the Japanese militarists who were, even after the bombings and the Russian declaration of war, still promising to fight to the last, with the desperate idea of somehow securing better terms for themselves. But they didn't do that once the emperor intervened. And the emperor intervened not to avoid more cities being destroyed. Remember, dozens of cities had already been destroyed. The emperor intervened to protect the imperial office. In a post-war interview, he explained one of his reasons for choosing to intervene as being that, quote, if the enemy landed near Ise Bay, both Ise and Atsuta shrines would immediately come under their control. There would be no time to transfer the sacred regalia of the imperial family, and no hope of protecting them. Now, you'd think that protecting the imperial knickknacks would be an unmentionably minor concern when compared to the nuclear bombing raids, but apparently not. The emperor took all this emperor business very seriously, as did the rest of the Japanese government. The militarists on the Supreme Council might have wanted to hold out for better terms, even if it meant fighting to the death, but they were not prepared to contradict the will of the emperor.
It sounds laughable in many respects, but it is the most believable thing about Japanese people in general. Is that, oh, Jesus Christ, dude. Like 1,000,000%. Aspects of this kind of thinking have seeped into modern Japanese existence in very meaningful ways, which I've talked about time and time again. Some of which is positive, as a matter of fact, and has been a counterweight to existing under a really horrifyingly exploitative capitalist superstructure. But it is really interesting. Unbelievable.
Admiral Leahy wrote in his memoirs that himself and Secretary Stimson, in their combined staff meetings, were, quote, certain that the Mikado, that's an antiquated term for the emperor there, could stop the war with a royal word. And this turned out to be accurate. That is how the war was stopped on the Japanese end. Now, I don't want to get too deep into speculation about alternate history timelines today, but I think it's fairly obvious that President Truman and James Burns deleting the offer to retain the imperial institution from the Potsdam Declaration almost certainly lengthened the war. If the emperor didn't intervene to bring about a surrender immediately upon receiving peace terms that assured his position, he almost certainly would have when that was coupled with a Soviet declaration of war. Japan had only been holding out for Russian mediation in the hopes of securing better peace terms. After the Soviet declaration of war, that option was fully off the table, so I'd say it's vastly more likely than not that, having in hand both a declaration of war from the Soviet Union and surrender terms from the other allies that assured the imperial house would survive, the emperor would have ended the war right there, regardless of whether Japan had been hit with nuclear bombs or not. Henry Stimson later noted in his memoirs that it is possible, in light of the final surrender, that a clearer and earlier exposition of American willingness to retain the emperor would have produced an earlier ending to the war. And he concluded in 1948 that history might find that the United States, by its delay in stating its position, had prolonged the war. Now, it would be very simple to conclude at this point that, with regard to the end of the war, the question of the emperor was everything, and the nuclear bombs didn't do anything. But is that really the case? Let's pose a few questions. Firstly, we can ask, were the bombs necessary to defeat Japan militarily? And the answer to that is obviously no. The Japanese leadership were beaten, and they knew they were beaten long before the bombs were dropped. So, were the bombs necessary to defeat Japan without needing to carry out a ground invasion of the 4 main Japanese islands? Well, to start with, we've quoted multiple US military leaders today who say that Japan was ready to surrender without either an invasion or the bombs being necessary. But can we really trust their judgment of the situation? You see, those leaders had a couple of potential reasons to downplay the effectiveness of the bomb. The first of these is simply that they didn't want to be put out of a job by this thing. The worry there was that if the atomic bombs really are that effective, then maybe we don't need such a large conventional military force anymore, so clear your desk. And another reason, I imagine, was pride. If it's you who's been fighting the war all this time, backing Japan into a corner and bringing them to the verge of surrender, you probably don't want the narrative afterwards to be scientists save the day and end the war with their new bomb. It kind of undercuts all the work you did prior to that. So I can see the motive there for US military leaders at the time to say, hey, hang on, Japan was already beaten. We did that. The bomb was not necessary. However, these ulterior motives do not mean that the military leader...
He's thoroughly covering every angle. That's what Sean does. Like, this doesn't mean that that's his genuine perspective on it. I just want everyone to understand.
who spoke out against the bomb were necessarily...
Because I see a lot of people being like, well, hold up, I thought they were doing it to flex on the USSR or whatever. Like, that. No, that is the final conclusion of this story. It's just that this aspect is basically discussing all other alternative motives.
Lying or wrong. We know from what we've talked about today that the Japanese leadership was close to surrender and was, as President Truman wrote in his diary, asking for peace. Japan would have surrendered long before an invasion if, for instance, they thought they could secure terms which were acceptable to them. They didn't actually want to be invaded just for the sake of it. They were holding out for an invasion in the hopes of avoiding an unconditional surrender. So US military leaders who claimed the bombs were not necessary to end the war were correct, even if they had an ulterior motive for saying so. Instead of a motivation to lie, they could just have easily have had a motivation to tell an uncomfortable truth. So then, were the bombs necessary to force Japan to offer to surrender on the Allied terms without any conditions? And the answer to this is also no, because they didn't do that. Even after...
We're not watching the whole thing. I'm just showing you the final discussion.
2 atomic bombs, the Japanese leadership still only offered to surrender on the condition that they were assured they could keep the emperor. And between that offer to surrender and their eventual actual surrender, they didn't get hit with any more nuclear bombs. All this being said, I do not think that the nuclear bombs had absolutely no effect at all on Japan's decision to surrender. It would be going much too far to make that claim, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I'd say there were 2 main effects that the bombs had upon the end of the war. Firstly, the nuclear bomb probably indirectly shortened the war, because its existence prompted Truman to try to finish the war without the Soviet Union, which in turn prompted Stalin to speed up his plans to declare war on Japan, and that declaration of war sped up the emperor intervening in the Supreme Council to bring about an offer to surrender, with their condition, of course. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on the 8th of August, and it's likely that if they weren't racing to get in the war as quickly as possible, they would have declared war later in August sometime. The 15th is what Stalin told Truman at Potsdam. So we can say that, all other things being equal, the existence of the atomic bomb probably shortened the war by a week or so. The other effect the nuclear bomb had on the end of the war is a rather interesting one. And let's read a post-war quote from Cabinet Secretary Sakomizu talking about the bomb. The chance had come to end the war. It was not necessary to blame the military side, the manufacturing people, or anyone else. Just the atomic bomb. It was a good excuse. Someone said the atomic bomb was the kamikaze to save Japan. So, the bomb provided the non-military Japanese leadership with an excuse to proclaim defeat that didn't involve blaming or shaming their proud military. It lessened the risk of a revolt of the armed forces, and it was a way to end the war while salvaging some pride, as well as casting those killed by the bombs not as civilian war victims, but as heroic martyrs. The Emperor's radio announcement declaring the end of the war took a similar approach. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb.
It's such a weird thing to just like try to look at the positive aspects of this, you know what I mean? But I think it's good to cover it because it then shows you how ridiculous it was to drop the bomb in and of itself, to let the emperor save face. Like, you're stretching extra hard to find any meaningful way of trying to justify it. You know what I mean? It's almost as ridiculous as like fucking talking about how anime became a thing. So I guess it was kind of all right. You know what I mean? Like, guys, I know the nuclear bombs happened, but also like anime, you know, which led to the creation of One Piece. I mean, think about that. Hideo Kojima made some fucking bangers, you know? Ridiculous. You always have to weigh the consequences, certainly, but I think in this situation, at least, when you weigh the consequences, you realize Unlike the top of the hour ad break, which comes at the top of every hour, which is 3 minutes long, that you can totally avoid with a $5 a month subscription or a free one in the form of a Twitch Prime, the nuclear bomb was not worth it. The atom bomb was not worth it. Just simply was not. That's it. But the 3-minute ad break could be worth it for you. But if you don't think it is, then all you need to do is subscribe for $5 or free with a Twitch Prime by connecting your Amazon Prime account to a Twitch account where you get one free Prime subscription a month. Here is the 3-minute ad break now. All right, I'm done with this, and I'm done with Oppenheimer, Sloppenheimer. Here.